Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Enlightenment, Part 1. Let's get into it. Now, the Enlightenment was a broad-based movement that lasted nearly over the course of a century, across the arc of much of the 18th century or the 1700s. It happened in phases. While that's true, we need to look at some of the political, social, cultural, economic, religious conditions that existed primarily in the 17th century to understand what would lead folks into a broad-based era of political debate and ultimately revolution by the time the next century rolls around. I'm going to focus mostly on the political situation, but for the purposes of this short video. But again, if we look at the arc of the 1600s across particularly Europe, this is an era in which the 30 Years' War occurs. This is the era in which, you're looking at the end of, the Renaissance has come to an end. You're looking at the rise of new artistic movements. You're looking at really an era of the development of the Atlantic world. You're looking at, a lot that is occurring. You're looking at the era of scientific revolution that is ongoing as well. All right. But for our purposes for this video, there's a few terms that are important for us to understand. And the first term that is important for us to understand is Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes, as a writer in the middle part of the 17th century, publishes a fairly important work that is often referred to as Leviathan. And Leviathan and the premise of what's dealt within connects a bit to a political event that happens in the 1640s mostly, but before too, in England in the 17th century, and that's the English Civil War. And so the premise of Leviathan, and this idea that we need a sort of strong government to save us from ourselves, and again, I'm being rather sort of paraphrasy with some of that, some of that's on display with the English Civil War. So England, of course, by the time you get to the early 1600s, had seen, since the era of the Reformation and the Catholic Reformation, had seen political upheaval, it had seen religious upheaval, it had seen changes in monarchs, it had seen religious persecution. By the time you get to the early 1600s, you're going to see monarchs that come in that don't call parliament into session, that by the time you get to the early 1640s, the king calls, Charles calls parliament back into session in order to go to war. Parliament basically says no, and so what ends up happening is you end up with a war between the crown and parliament, right? So oftentimes you have this Puritan war versus the crown, and it is won by parliament. It is won by forces that were Puritan in support of Oliver Cromwell. And what ends up happening is the king, by the end of the 1640s, is executed, right? So you've got Thomas Hobbes and this idea of a strong government is necessary to save us from ourselves. So this kind of political philosophy of the middle part of the 17th century, again, reflecting some of the news of the day, because the English Civil War was a very shocking reality. And that's the other point for us here, for those who were in Europe at the time, in the idea that this monarch was executed. This brings us to our next point, which is John Locke. Now, John Locke was also a prolific, writer and political philosopher, whose Second Treatise of Government and others are incredibly important texts for framing much of our understanding of the political aspects of the Enlightenment. And this idea that we're all born with a clean slate, this tabula rasa, right? This idea of these processes of life and liberty and property that he's writing about, are really central for later actors, both in France during the era of their revolution and in America during our revolution as well. Right? So someone like Thomas Jefferson in particular is going to respond directly to this. So John Locke and his writings. Another is going to be the English Revolution, or the Glorious Revolution. Now, this comes to us in the 1680s, specifically in 1688. And what you end up with here is a concern that the monarch was going to restore Catholicism, and so there was a movement to kick him out. That process happens. William and Mary are brought in to take the throne, with the understanding that the English Bill of Rights would be signed, supporting and cementing power for Parliament, which happens the next year. What you end up with then, by the time you get to the end of the 17th century, really is this kind of discourse between different forms of government. So you end up with this idea of some European kingdoms and countries embracing absolutism and others embracing forms of constitutionalism. All right. Thank you very much.